Okay, hi everybody, and welcome to ThrillerCon. And this is the panel on Writing is Rewriting. And we have, well, there's three panelists plus me, so I guess I count as a panelist. So we're just going to go ahead and introduce ourselves and talk about, what you've written and etc. So I guess we'll start with you, Whitney. Hi, Whitney.
Hey, well, to introduce myself, I have a small editing business that I run by myself. I do it full time. It's the only job that I do now currently. I just quit my full-time job in April to do that. I have a bachelor's degree for the background for journalism and communication and literature. Otherwise, my fun facts are I got married on Halloween. I have 4 kids with 1 on the way, and I have 5 rescue animals. So it's a busy house.
Wow, okay, that's exciting. Emily, I'll go last.
Oh, I had to unmute me. I'm Emily Colin. I write both adult women's fiction and I write YA dystopian fantasy. My first book, The Memory Thief, was a New York Times bestseller, and that book, as well as my second book, The Dreamkeeper's Daughter, were both for an adult audience. And then I have a YA dystopian romantic trilogy, which is The Seven Sins. And that one is about a world in which people live and die by the rules of the 7 deadly sins. So that sounds a bit dark, but since it's one of my books, there's also lots of kissing, even though love is forbidden. Yeah, that's me.
Yay. Heidi?
Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, wherever you're from. Thank you so much for having me. My name is Heidi Ayarbe. I have 4 contemporary YA fiction novels that have been published. I've also worked in the nonfiction market for kids, and recently wrote my first short story, which was exciting because I didn't have to spend years on it, which is a treat. And I'm excited to speak with everybody today. And fun facts about me is I actually live in Colombia, South America, in the coffee region. And I don't have as full a house as Whitney, but I do have 2 daughters. Yeah, I have 2 daughters and a couple of dogs. One lives here, one lives at a farm. And I'm really looking forward to hugging people soon. We're almost to the hugging stage in Colombia. We haven't quite got there yet, so I can't wait for that. So I'm excited to be here.
Well, and then I'll introduce myself. I am Lisa Amowitz, she, her, and I am in New York, where hugging has commenced in a major way. Lots of hugging. Lots of vaccinated people, so maybe we're playing it fast and loose, but we're having a good time. So anyway, I am actually a professor of graphic design, and I run a program, a digital design program at a community college here in New York City. I am not currently in New York City. I am currently ensconced upstate New York in a very nice pastoral environment to get out of the city. Anyway, so I'm a cover designer. I have 3 young adult books out quite a while ago. They're thrillers, fantasies, etc. I recently, and I guess the thing we didn't mention was that Emily, Heidi, myself, and a number of other people published an anthology during the pandemic called Unbound, which we're all really proud of. And that was the short, and I contributed a short story to that as well. Currently, I'm getting ready to pitch my first adult, spec fiction book. And that's really exciting. And I'm also getting ready to become an indie publisher by re-releasing my first book, Breaking Glass. There's Unbound, yeah. And I worked on the cover with one of our partners, Sarah Anderson. Anyway, now that we've gotten through the intros, let's move on to our first question. And I think we'll just do round robin the way we did with Whitney, Emily, Heidi, and I'll go last. That way I could be as brief as needed. Okay, so our first question is, before we actually, it's really not, well, it is a question, but it's like a precursor question. Before we start discussing rewriting, let's talk about how you write. And also, Whitney, I hope this is actually relevant to you as an editor, so you could skew it however you want to your process. But let's talk about how you write, your process writing the first draft. What is your approach? Research and careful outline planning, letting the words flow freely, or a combination of both? You want to tackle that, Whitney?
So I actually do some personal writing as well. I have a novel that's a fantasy romance in the works, and then I write short stories as well. And I do offer book coaching through the business of mine. I'm getting my master's in creative writing. So writing questions, as you know, this is based around very applicable for me too, both for what I tell my clients and then what I do for myself. Personally, I'm more of the plantser category, where I do my research until I get to a point where I feel knowledgeable in whatever topic, and then I just let the words flow. I'll go back with more planning as needed, but usually my first draft, it's just all pantsing the words as they flow out.
Cool. Emily?
Yeah, so I forgot to say, and maybe I should have said because it's relevant to revisions, is that I also work as an editor. And so I think that that is helpful to me in my process all along the way. And I'm always thinking about my writing with an eye to editing. I don't think I could really help it for good or ill. So when I write my first drafts, the very first time that I, oh, hi, Rick. The very first time, hi, Rick. The very first book that I wrote, I had been an editor and I was like, oh, well, then I've got this, you know, I've worked on other people's books. And then I sat down to write and I was like, I don't have this at all. And I realized that it was a really different process being on the other side of the desk. And so when I wrote that first book, I wrote it in the way that comes most naturally to me, but didn't actually turn out to be the best process imaginable. So that one, I wrote it as snippets came into my mind. I did not write it in order. I had a concept. I knew the beginning, I knew the end, but I did not write it, you know, consecutively. I wrote these little snippets and then I sort of stitched them together. And that is the way that, left to my own devices in the world, is the most fun and natural way for me to write. But it actually did not at all turn out to be the most effective way for me to write, because then I tried, and that book did really well, yay, whatever. And then I tried to do that again with my second book, and it was a disaster. Like, I produced this 600-page tome that could have been used as like a sleep aid or a weapon or a doorstop or it was terrible, y'all. It was just bad. Like, I feel fine saying that now. I was heartbroken at the time, but it was really terrible. And I realized that some of the good stuff that I had done when I wrote that first book, I did by accident. Like, I didn't even know why it was working. I just knew that it, yeah. Hi again, Rick. I knew that it was.
I don't realize this is on live.
I know. That's okay. He's going to be famous. But this is Rick's claim to fame. Yeah. Yeah, so, oh my gosh. So that really was like a wake-up call to me, because I think that I did some things right in my first book accidentally without knowledge of the process, and then I couldn't replicate it. It just didn't replicate. So what I do now, after lots of learning along the way, is that I've discovered what I do well instinctively and what I don't do well instinctively. And what I don't do well instinctively is plot and stakes. And what I do well instinctively is character, banter, dialogue, and interaction, as Heidi and Lisa know very well about me. So what I now do is, even though I didn't want to plot stuff out in the beginning because I thought it was so boring and it felt like writing a book report, I get all my characters' goals to begin with. And like, I'm really clear in their wants and their needs and their obstacles and everything. And then I do like sort of save the cat plot outline. And then I do a 3-sentence sort of thing for each scene. And I never thought that I would be a person who did that, because it's so much upfront work and it feels so boring even when I say it. But I have discovered that it results in so much less revision and rewriting on the other end. It makes me produce a draft that's far tighter. And of course, I can switch it up along the way. So all of that is to say, I started one way. I'm one way in my natural habitat, but I have evolved or something like a Pokemon. I don't know. I've evolved like based on the fact that I realized that like my approach truly needed to be revised. Oh my God, it's a horrible pun. I'm not talking anymore. Bye.
I choose you. Heidi.
I love hearing about people's processes because I continue to be a pantser. The whole first draft idea is intimidating because when you create, and everybody has ideas, but when you choose an idea and you sort of marry that idea, I'm a slow writer. It could take me anywhere from a year to this last novel I've been working on. It took me 4 years to get through the first draft, which sounds painful, but I don't want you to think I spent 8 hours a day doing it. No, I have jobs and I have work and so I feel like where I tighten, I don't think I'm as effective, like what Emily was saying. I feel like I overwrite a lot, but in that overwriting, sometimes I find gems that otherwise I might not have found, and I say that's where it is. So I'm willing to cut thousands and thousands and thousands of words in revision, so I can find that little golden nugget. But I just want you all to know the golden nugget often doesn't come, because I feel like you hear these things from writers and you feel like this magical thing. I have no muses. I have the thing I have is BIC inspiration, but in chair. And I say, this is the day I have to put down 1,000 words. And maybe of those 1,000 words, I have 10 that work, but it was worth the time. Not very efficient, not very effective, but I like writing from this place of potential and possibility. And I just like writing words on a page. So eventually I get there, but sometimes.
Well, it's always a pleasure to read both of your drafts. We are, just to full disclosure, we're writing partners, the three of us, along with a few other people. Heidi and Heidi's potentially probably one of my first writer buddies from the way back when. And Heidi could blackmail with me with some of my early writing. Like if she has any snippets of it, she could actually make a lot of money off of it because it was so bad. Anyway, so yeah, I think that's the thing that I will share with you from the way back when machine. When I first started writing, I did not understand how much writing is rewriting, how it's not this precious thing that when you first start writing, it takes you so long to get to your first draft that when it's done, you think, oh, I am done. I have written the book. And you don't realize that that's when the fun begins. So for me, it's been a long time since I've been writing, and it's not my main thing. I'm more of an artist by trade, but it is like, I think I found it to be the main thing of my heart. And I've learned that the rewriting for me is the most fun, but it's all fun. Like as long as you are aware of that's the journey and the process, for me, the point is joy. It has to be joyful. Like I'm not worried anymore about who's going to read this. Is it going to sell? I'm like, I want to enjoy this process. I want to make this the best I can. And I love when I get to share with my writing squad and they give me feedback. And I don't care if the feedback is horrible, fromage, all the things that Heidi said to me over the years. She looks so innocent and sweet. And Emily, well, I have a phrase about Emily, but I'm not going to share it right now. But Emily is an amazing editor. She could cut so much of my crap out of a book. It's like unbelievable. That I can't even believe a person could put so much crap into one piece of writing. But my process is that now it's different than it used to be. I used to be a complete pantster. I'd sit down. I would do a lot of thinking about backstory and character wants and needs and all this stuff. I've always done that. But then in terms of what was going to happen, I had no idea. So this time when I set about last year in last summer, I finally sat down to write this book that I sat on so long that I call it Egg. Literally, it's called Egg. We all call it Egg because it took me that long to hatch the idea. I would say 4 years of sitting on an idea. But finally, last summer, I sat down to write it, having completed my research. And this time I was very methodical about how I did it because it was such a crazy and complicated concept. I didn't even believe that I could make it work when I started. And I'm happy to report that it's finished now and it's in its last read-throughs from people. Yeah, and I can't believe it. They actually like it. But the way I did it was I used the save the cat technique, but I had a problem in that I had 3 storylines that were taking place all, simultaneously, and they all had to connect. So it was like, I honestly can't even believe that I got it to work. So I would say my first concern was just making this clunky, awkward, bizarre thing work and make sense. And that took me a good 6 months to do. And then after having done all that, during NaNoWriMo in November, I sat down and in about 6 weeks, I literally, I would say, vomited the whole thing out according to my outline. But I changed things up, but I kind of stuck to it. So then what happened, Emily read it, and of course she cut out a good deal of the verbiage, the repetitive stuff. And I should probably move on here. Anyway, to make a long story short, it got to its 3rd draft. And in the 3rd draft was when Emily looked at it and said, well, you have to really get back to your character stakes. What does your character want? How does this reinforce their journey? So that was the layering, the last layer that was really fun to do for me. I tend to think of visuals and stuff and excitement and forget personalities and characters and things like that. So I'm the opposite of these guys in some ways. All right, so enough from me. Let's move on to our next question. So for your 2nd draft, would you say that you share with beta readers or do you just review yourself? Like you've just barfed out that 1st draft. Do you actually let anybody read it at this point? Or do you just read through yourself? How does it work for you? Or is it different every time? Whitney?
For me, I, will barf out my 1st draft and then I do some rounds of self-edits until I feel pretty confident in it. And then I'll let some alpha or beta readers go at it then. If I feel like it's, developmentally challenged in a way that I just can't get around myself, I'll usually go to like a critique partner or developmental editor first. Because I feel like betas do really great at being your test readers, but I wouldn't give an unfinished draft to my test reader. So that's usually how I use them.
Okay. Emily?
So I am, I like to get my 1st draft as polished as possible. I seem to be incapable of vomiting out a draft. I wish that I could. I wish I could just sort of bleh it out and then just go back and like revise it later. I think I would write a lot more quickly if I could do that. I also wish that I could dictate my books for the same reason, because I think that that would also move along more quickly. But I've tried that and I realized that I cannot do that because my process is to go through and really just like review each sentence as I write it, review each thought as I write it, and really just by the time I get done with the 1st draft, if I've gotten stuck, I've gone to critique partners along the way and I've said, hey, I've got this sticky plot point. A lot of the time I'll do that before I even start writing in the first place, as I'm working through stuff in my outline, because I just discovered that like it saves me so much stress. I get so stressed out where I'm like find myself in the middle of the story and then have to rewrite everything because the stakes just didn't come naturally. And parenthetically, I will say that so I teach writing also, and I have discovered like there's a bunch of people who have said, hey, like the way that you teach plotting and stuff really resonates with me. And I thought about it and I realized that it's probably because it does not come naturally to me. And so I've had to really dig down into like take it apart, like what's under the hood, how does this work, and find a number of different approaches. I think it's those things that we find most challenging to do that maybe we can teach the best, whereas those things that come instinctively, we cannot. So all of those sticky wicket things, I try to work out in the beginning. So by the time my first draft is done, oh, here's John. He says, I'm an Emily. I can't word vomit. It's hell being a perfectionist. Yes, John, I concur. I am with you. So by the time my first draft is done, it is my first draft in that I have not gone back through and really like revisited any of the major issues that may have arisen. But it's pretty clean, and any of the major character issues or pacing issues or plot issues I've tried to work out up front. Now, that being said, I have something that's on sub right now that's an adult book. And so I got it like as good as I could get it. It went through all the things. I proofed it in all the bazillion ways that I do such things. And then when it got to potential editors, they were like, okay, well, we really think that to be marketable, it should come more from this angle. So that's a very different thing for me. Then that's like a sort of deeper vision that I have to go back into. But by the time that first draft is done, it's ready for me to show to a beta reader. And I usually I do it in stages. So I'll show it to like one person first and get their feedback before I show it to somebody else, and then see if somebody else has like the second, like if they concur, if they have the same sort of, where'd she go?
Where did it go?
I don't know her camera. I don't know what happened. But yeah, so I do my beta reading in stages. And if
you had to step back for a minute.
Yeah. So if one or more people agree that something is an issue, then I'll go back in it and change it, because otherwise it can be so subjective. But yeah, that is my process.
Well, actually, I have a question for Whitney. I don't know if she can hear us, and Emily, because as editors, I think it would be interesting for viewers to know I'm curious to know when you think it would be a good point to share it with an editor, because there are two kinds of editor experiences. One, you're gonna pay an editor to help you develop your book, or another when you're ready to shop your book. And in what stage do you recommend as editors that writers send you their work, and not only to save them money but to save them time? I'm curious to hear what you have to say, if that's okay. I don't mean to take away the questions.
Okay, that's a good question.
I don't know if Whitney's here. If not, well, I'll just say what I think. So here's one thing that I have discovered, and it might not be as applicable to you because you're so much more of an experienced writer, but I will say this. So when I teach writing, one of the things that I always do is I have my students do a log line. Oh, there's Whitney. A log line, a hook, and a synopsis, right? And one reason why I have them do this is that if someone is brand new to the world of writing, where they have never written a book before, sometimes they spend a whole lot of time writing out the entire manuscript without really understanding what needs to happen in order. Where does the inciting incident go? Where does the dark night of the soul go? All of these things that are just intrinsic to the way we as human beings experience and love and enjoy stories. If they have not yet written a book, it's really helpful for me when I'm teaching to be able to look at their synopses and their hooks and be like, oh, okay, so are you just not capturing what happened in your book correctly here? Or is this not actually on the page, right? So for beginning writers, I might say that it might be useful at the very beginning to just hire someone to look at your synopsis and look at your hook and just make sure that it's strong and that it's in tune with the market that you are approaching. There's some people who have written things in my YA class where it's clear when I'm looking at it that it's going to be a great middle grade novel, but it's not actually YA. And I could have saved them a whole lot of trouble and stress if we had come at it from that angle. So that being said, for more experienced writers, I think probably what's most useful is if you're going to utilize any kind of developmental edit, to do it right before it goes out on sub. So you have employed all your usual techniques as an experienced writer. You have gone through it. You've proofed it to the best of your ability. You've copy edited it. Your alpha and beta readers, or whatever your process, you looked at it. You have gotten it as good as you can. You know what your comps are. You have a basic sense of what's out there on the market. And now you're like, okay, it's ready to go out, but I know that I maybe only have one shot at these editors. So let me send it to either a developmental editor who's also an author who's had success in this genre, or a developmental editor who's worked in the trenches, and I know that they have their finger on the pulse of the market. And just to be really careful about what editor you choose and why, because an editor who's right for one thing, of course, is not right for another. But I do think that no matter how experienced that you are as an author, if you're able to afford it, that it doesn't hurt to get professional developmental editing eyes on something before you send it out on sub.
Okay, great. So I'm not actually going to answer that question to just for the sake of time. So for me, because I might have actually answered it the first question. So I'm going to ask the third question, and I'll answer it, and then we'll go around from there. So the third question isn't really a question; it's an ask. Define good writing in your own judgment, what you think it is. And I'll start with that. For me, good writing is something that makes me really care, engrosses me in a world, takes me into a world, and makes me really care about the characters in that world. It makes me really want to know and turn the page to find out what happens to them. And while that's happening, I love to enjoy the world, but I also love to enjoy the words. To me, that's good writing, where I could enjoy something on many levels, and to the point where I'm so engrossed where I just can't stop reading. And that's where I want to be. And for me, if I can do that, I don't care if something ever sells or doesn't sell. I'm just going to be, that's it. That's what I want. Whitney?
So for me, good writing would be something that can really hook your readers in. Not only does it hook them in, but it continues to keep them hooked. So they're connected to your characters, they're engrossed in your world, they can feel your plot coming. They don't quite know where it's going in most cases, if you have any plot twists in there, but they're interested. They don't get bored, they feel connected.
Emily?
I think for me, good writing is what both of you have said. It's writing that makes you really care about the characters that you're reading about. So, I think that we've all read stuff that's like technically proficient, like the craft is really good, and you're like, but I just don't care. And like, why don't I care? I should care. Look at these beautiful lyrical sentences. Like, they're gorgeous. They're like gems and poems and like Renaissance paintings of sentences. And I don't give a what. And so, and then there are books that you're like, oh my God, this is terribly written, and yet I can't stop turning the pages. Somebody stop me. So like, I feel like what I kind of have learned from that, and I think Lisa Cron touches on it a little bit in Story Genius, and I really agree, it's that, story minus good technical writing is going to trump like good technical writing minus story every time. And so like, to me, the real holy grail is when you can do both. When you have this story with high stakes and characters that you really desperately care about, and a plot that is chugging along like an engine, and the characters inform the plot and vice versa. And on top of everything else, the sentences are freaking brilliantly crafted. That to me is what good writing is.
Yeah. Heidi?
Honestly, I don't think I can add to anything all of you have said. It's sometimes crazy. Like you said, it's an intangible sometimes, because there's something more behind it than just words and sentences. I like, there are phrases that you say, what, like her face is slander. I think that was from The Book Thief. There are phrases that stick with you and you're like, anyway, I hope one day to achieve good writing. And a lot of people say, oh, well, good writing happens to everybody that work on it. It's something we're all trying to get to. And I just love reading it. So I'm grateful that there are all these great minds, and sometimes dark, twisted minds, who continue to pump out beautiful things.
Oh, that's great. I'm going to actually ask the fourth question. I'm going to start with you, Heidi, this time. So you get to be first. What do you think hooks a reader? Because it kind of leads into what you're saying. So what do you think hooks a reader and keeps them interested? Conflict, mystery, emotional stakes, something that I didn't mention, or any combination thereof?
I think it depends on your reader. This is YA thriller con, and I don't think necessarily YA thriller readers would be hooked in a contemporary literary story the same. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. For me personally, it's always character. I'm a very character-based writer and reader. I think it depends on your reader. I don't read horror because I have bad dreams, and I don't read romance because, ask Lisa, I cannot write a kissing scene to save my life. I'm like, that's so awkward and weird. So it doesn't mean, so I think every genre hooks differently, and I don't think there's a right or a wrong. And I think basically though, in anything, you have to have a good story. You have to have a good story, and you have to have a character that means something to you, whether you're going to put them through a wood chopper or wood chipper, or whether you're going to throw them in Turkey with a romantic scene. That's what I think. But it depends on your reader.
Okay. I'm going to mix it up here. What do you think, Whitney?
I actually would agree. I think it depends on the readers that you're going after. If it's purely emotional stakes and you're doing like a middle grade type of novel, they, might not always relate the same way as they would for an adult novel, so there's going to be differences that you have to adapt to with each genre. For a thriller, I feel, to really hook them in, starting somewhere where that's on the cusp of the change of the character's life. Like, you have to think about your character as this person living their life. Things have been happening, and now the novel is starting when things are changing. So as long as you find a good grasp on where that change has happened, then I think your hook's going to be great. And you just have to keep that story, at expectation. You can't have a great hook and then kind of fall flat with your story. You have to keep hooking them with each chapter, each page.
Exactly. Emily?
Oops, sorry, I had to unmute myself. I completely agree about the genre expectation, and that, what hooks a reader and keeps them reading depends on the genre. So this being YA thriller con, if I'm thinking about a thriller, what's going to hook the reader? Of course, always these characters that we are going to understand who they are. We're going to care deeply about them, and the stakes are going to be both personal to them and then global to the novel as a whole. So we care about what happens in the overarching plot, but we also care what happens to these individual people. And really, like I said before, for me, what keeps a reader hooked is, what does Blake Snyder say? The promise of the premise, right? So your big hook, your big picture hook, your splashy thing that gets everybody like, yeah, I want to read that. Like A Human Zoo in Space, like Megan Shepard's The Hunt. Like, that's a great hook. So like, that's the promise of her premise. So if that's not a thriller, but sci-fi, but whatever, if that's what you say your book is going to be about, then when people get to that middle section of the novel, they're going to expect to see the human zoo happening in outer space. And if they don't, the hook is going to go, wah, 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 and then it's just going to be gone, right? So for me, for a thriller, I'm looking for fast-paced action. I'm looking for fast-paced dialogue. I'm looking for the plot to be an engine that keeps moving forward. I'm looking for the stakes to become incrementally higher as we go. I'm going to look for the characters to get more stressed out and worried about, like, oh my gosh, what's going to happen? It's getting worse. And so that for me is something that, is really important. But I do think it's so genre specific. Like, I'm the opposite of Heidi, where I love to write kissing scenes. And like, it's not a book of mine if it doesn't have a kissing scene, right? And so for me, like, my guilty pleasure during this whole pandemic nonsense was to read like all the contemporary romance I could get my hands on. And like, because it's so tropey, right? For a lot of people, that would be completely boring. Like, there's that trope, and so that I did a lot of thinking about, well, why would I even care? How does that hook keep going if the tropes are just the same? And it boils down to character. Like, to me, that is like a sure indication of what drives a story. If you can keep the tropes the same, but the characters are people that you care enough about, even when you know it's going to end happily, which makes me think all the more so when you're writing something like a thriller where the plot is a really strong engine, you want to make sure that the characterization is equally strong.
Okay, so I'm going to add to that. I agree with everything everyone said. And as a person who is plot driven and writes thrillers, who lives for mysteries and bad things happening to the characters, etc., like as bad as I could imagine. I have had to learn, kind of by having my hand held to the flame, do not forget what the character wants, what their motives are. This is Emily pushing me this way. And do not forget to sort of always kind of reach back to your theme. You know, there has to be something that the character needs to learn, and the character has to have agency. That's another thing that I think I always have to remind myself. Like, you can't always have stuff happening to the character. A lot of it has to be something that the character makes happen, which is agency. Otherwise, it just feels like, you know, something's just flashing by and it's not making any sense. I mean, another thing I think that's really important to remember when you're writing a thriller, and I will say that I think I've always had this kind of instinct for pacing, right, guys? I mean, that's like the thing, plotting. Like, I was born telling stories, and I didn't have the craft, but I had like the story, as Victoria Schwab calls it, the story monster, like the story corpse. I always had that in me. Like, I kind of knew where it was going. But so for me, it's always like remembering to flesh out that character, like have that human element, even in the middle of the most terrifying thing. Have them learn something, gain something, have the relationships deepen, and have their dialogue always relate to it. Don't put anything in there that takes you off. It's my favorite phrase from Stephen King, kill your darlings, which of course I love at Thrillicon. That's perfect, right? Like, kill your darlings. So, okay, I am going to move on.
Lisa, can I add to that?
Yes.
If we're talking about character, one of the favorite things I ever learned from an editor was, she said, if you ever get lost, your character, usually you have one point of view. Some people do the omniscient thing, but generally in YA fiction, it's a one point of view or chapter by chapter, but nevertheless, it's not that omniscient. Your character has a lens through which he or she sees the world. And that lens is critical in establishing the stakes and who that character is. And so whenever you get lost, you always have to set back and say, wait a second, what is my character's lens? Because sometimes you get in the way and they're like, no, this is too rational. My character's lens is different. And I think that's one of the coolest things you can do, is always revert to that lens and say, okay, this is where the problem is. And that's a really helpful skill when you're in revising your manuscript, because sometimes you lose that lens because it gets blurred, and it always has to be that sharp focus lens for that one character.
I think that's like a really amazing way of, and it kind of leads into the next question, really. I think that's an amazing way, amazing way of looking at it, to just look at it through the character's eyes, and not only how they would react, but how would they, like, what kind of metaphors would they come up with? You know, like, it has to be geared. That's something you're really amazing at, Heidi, like really making these very idiosyncratic and quirky characters, and every word they utter really reinforces their character and whatever little obsession they have or focus. And that is really great. Some of my favorite writers do that. Leigh Bardugo, I think, is amazing at that. Her characters are so unique, and their behavior and the things they say and the things that catches their eye when they're looking at a scene reinforces the character. So I think that is like a credo to carry with you when you rewrite. You know, really put yourself in that character's seat and think about what they're feeling, seeing, thinking, experiencing, but don't overdo it, because sometimes people get really caught up in too many details, you know, like they think it's a scene from a movie, and, you know, you have to see and feel everything that's happening. Okay, so I'm going to move on to the next question, and I'm going to hope that there's not too much noise in the background here, because I'm in a kind of a small cottage with my husband and kid, and they're talkative. So I might have to mute myself and tell them to shut up. Okay, so how do you make sure, and I think Heidi may have answered this, but let's proceed and see what everyone else thinks. How do you make sure to up the stakes while connecting the action back to the character's wants? Whitney?
And I'm just gonna read up the stakes while connecting to the character's wants.
Yeah, how do you make sure to up the stakes while connecting the action back to the character's wants? You know, as you're getting all excited with like this truck is coming down the road and the character has to jump out of the way. And how do you make sure that we still know who this character is and what they're experiencing and how does it move their arc along, etc.?
I mean, I usually add some internal dialogue in with my action just to as Heidi said, refocus that lens back. I don't want anyone to, forget what they want. And then I always, throw something in their way. Like, well, the action is bringing you here and this is where you want. And, oh, yep, you're getting rerouted around. So I always try to, connect the character with their thoughts to keep the reader thinking about what they want and then continuously throw an obstacle in the way. And then they're like, man, like, I really wanted this. And then they get a little more stressed and a little more frustrated. Maybe my character gets a little more sloppy, makes things, mess up a little bit further. And then it causes a couple more issues and it helps kind of further my plot. I also think about background. So like, just because we're focusing on what my main character is doing, what's my antagonist doing in the background? Like my book might not be showing that right now, but it's still happening back there. Like you have to think about what everyone else is doing in the background too. So I'm thinking like, okay, well, this is what my story is talking about, but this is what my villain is planning. This is what my antagonist is doing right now. Or this is where like that negative plot points coming from, and then how do they merge? So I try to, plot as I pants my way through things.
That's really cool. I think that's a pretty good pantsing technique. Like you're experiencing like, oh my goodness, there's this truck coming. Oh, wait a minute. Okay, I'm going to step out of the way. Oh no, there's another truck coming. I mean, I like that. I relate to that well. Emily, Heidi, whoever feels inspired to jump in, jump.
I don't know. I mean, I guess I would say, like, for me, I'm always thinking about how plot influences character and character influences plot, because without the character piece, the plot is just like a string of events that just happens. And the only thing that really gives it, now there are some things that would just be stressful to anybody, like a natural disaster or the death of a loved one. There are things like that that just no matter who they happen to are going to be stressful. But then there are other things like having to speak in public or being faced with a large dog that like might be really scary to your character because maybe they're terrified of large dogs because they have been attacked by a dog, or maybe they are terrified to speak in public, but they know that they've got to nail this speech because if they don't, they're not going to get the scholarship. That's their only chance of getting into college or whatever. So for me, in any given situation, I'm always thinking about, okay, why this particular event happening to this particular character at this particular point in time? Because I've chosen that particular event because of how it's going to affect my main protagonist and my main antagonist, right? It's this event for a reason. So how they approach it, like Whitney was talking about, what comes out of our mouth half the time is not the same thing as what's going on in our mind. We might not say what we're thinking, but that's still happening. So for me, I always try to make every sentence that I write do two things. Like it's doing whatever it's supposed to do in the novel in terms of describing something, let's say, describing a scene, describing what somebody looks like, but it is also either moving the plot forward or teaching us something about our character. And so I think as long as that's happening, as long as you've got that lens that Heidi's talking about, where like I always tell my students, imagine that you've got a video camera. And if you are, telling the story through third person close, your character is walking in holding that video camera and you can only see what they see as they move the camera around and you can only feel what they feel. And if you know your character well, whether you plot or whether you pants, you still have to know who your character is at the core. You might be finding out little things about them. I think we all discover little things about our characters as we write, but at their heart, at their core, we know who they are, right? And so we know, okay, going into this scene, it's not just what's happening in the moment that's going to affect the character, like Whitney's talking about, but it's everything about their lives that have brought them to this point, and it's what's happening in the moment, and it's what they most hope for and fear will come out of this moment. So if you keep that whole character in mind while something happens, then it's going to act as an engine that's going to propel the plot forward.
Well said. Heidi, got anything to add to that?
Just one more thing, because it's exactly what you're saying. I became obsessed with Breaking Bad back in the day, because Breaking Bad to me still continues to be like flawless writing. And so I started reading about their process, and every single thing that happened in that story through the course of 9 seasons, I believe it was, every writer would sit and say, what would Walter White think or do? In every plot thing, even though he's not on screen, on thing, they had the plot line going here, and underneath they would say, what is Walter White thinking here? What is he doing here? Even though he's not in those scenes. And I felt like that was like, because at the end of the day, unless you do several protagonists, which does happen. I haven't done that before, but at the end of the day, you have a main character, and that character is the one that this story is usually about, and that character is the one that change happens, that has the change. And so I was obsessed with the way they created 9 seasons of, to me, what was pretty flawless writing. And it was character, and it was Walter White. Every scene, he's in every scene, even though he's not there. And that is pretty fabulous. But again, I'm a Breaking Bad fan, so I'm never going to say bad things about it.
Well, that's amazing, Heidi. All right, you guys, this has been great. We have one last quick question before the Q&A, if there's anyone who has any questions. Otherwise, we'll just keep talking. Last question is, do you have any tips or resources, more specifically, I guess, books, websites, etc., that you'd like to share to help add tension to your writing? I guess I'll start, if that's okay. I really like the Save the Cat software. I found that using that helped this pantser really understand the basic underlying structure that we all have, that stories have contained throughout history, kind of an archetype of how stories operate. And it's helped me a lot, just to get something going, to kind of force some crazy idea into making sense. So that would be mine. What about you, Whitney?
I also think Save the Cat is really helpful. The other tips that I would have would be to read your genre. Like, if you're writing a YA thriller, you should pick up some YA thrillers. I know Emily's mentioned, popular tropes and things like that, but it also gives you things to look for. Like, if you have 6 to 10 different authors that are all in the same genre, and they're all doing things in a similar way, even though their stories are unique and they're different, that gives you things to consider as well. And it might also spark some ideas of your own. So that's usually what I would do. I also find that there's free workshops, even if they're like more blog style with like an article, like a Q&A with an author. I love reading those. I think those, best-selling authors really give out some great tips and little nuggets of information that are very helpful.
Emily, I was muted.
So a lot of the things that people said, Save the Cat writes a novel, I think has been very useful for me. But I always read it. I think about it in terms of also hand in hand with Lisa Cron's Story Genius, because I think Save the Cat writes a novel can be all about the how, and Story Genius is all about the why. And so what I love about Story Genius is that it really focuses on, and Wired for Story is the same, it really focuses on why human beings are drawn to stories and what is present in every story, no matter what genre, no matter what. Why is this something that has survived over centuries, right? So those are two. And then I absolutely agree that reading books in your genre is absolutely a key thing to do, especially books that have been published in the past 5 years or 3 years. And I sometimes think about it as like reading with a different eye, reading with your editorial eye on, so that you're thinking about ripping away the Wizard of Oz curtain and you want to find out like who's really behind that curtain, who really is the wizard, right? Like if you see something that you really admire, or there's something that you really want to do in your book, whether it's multiple points of view, whether it's I don't know, a Sixth Sense style reveal, whatever it is, think of a book that's done that. Try to find a book that's done that you think has done that really well, and study it and figure out how that's worked. And the other thing I'll say real fast is that there are some, as Whitney said, incredible free sessions. And Y'all Fest this past year, which is typically live and in person in South Carolina, it became Y'all Write, WRITE this past year. And that's where Lisa pulled Victoria Schwab's what's it called? The Story Corps from. And so, places like that where you just have top-notch authors for free giving these amazing sessions on their little secrets. It may not be that like everything they say resonates with you, but you may get this one gem out of it that just clicks with you in your mind, where you're like, yes, that is the way to think of the thing that has been making me nutsy. So all of those sorts of things, I would say there's no one person or one thing that is going to be prescriptive, but just immersing yourself in a variety of different modalities is really helpful.
Great. So Heidi, we have 2 minutes before I think Madeline wants us to conclude. I don't know if there are any questions, so we'll see. Otherwise, we'll just close the show.
I'll give a couple of tips that are just, because I feel like sometimes you get these global tips and you're like, what do I do with that as a writer? Because it's intimidating, the whole revision process. And so I do recommend Second Sight by Cheryl Klein. She is now an editor at Lee & Low, and she is mad precise, which is the total opposite of who I am as a writer. This book has helped me a lot. Other little tips. If you can have somebody read your book to you, print it out the old-fashioned way, and you listen to your words, then you're going to be like, oh, it's horrifying, but it's really important, because if you are listening to it, you're going to hear things you didn't realize you were writing. And another book I loved, I love Stephen King's On Writing, and I love Anne Lamott. Again, though, they're a little bit sort of lofty sometimes. Like Stephen King's like, I write every day from 6 to 12, but Stephen King has a wife, and he has somebody doing dishes and has somebody taking care of the kids. So come on. I mean, let's be real. Another one I thought has been great is Writing Day Breakout Novel by Donald Mass. Some tips, but mostly take your time in revision. Take your time to go line by line revision that a lot of us sometimes forget to do, because we're always global revisers, and then you realize every other line you have the same word. Do word searches so you can see how many times the word amazingly fabulous shows up, and you're like, oh my God, I did that. So anyway, just take the time, and I will stop talking now, and enjoy the process.
Well, I just want to add one more thing to that before it goes to 156. What you said about listening to your own words, Emily and I both discovered this software called Voice Dream, where you're able to upload your own story, your own draft, into almost like an audio book. So
you don't have to torture anybody. You don't have to torture anybody. You can do it.
Well, right. I mean, I've read it out loud. Emily's actually read her stuff out loud to me, which was like great, like, oh, a living Audible book. And it was great for her. But I love doing that for myself. And I do it when I'm beta reading sometimes too. It's a really great thing. Anyway, so I think we got to close out the show. I kind of wonder, I don't think there are any questions. Am I right, Madeline? I guess we don't have any Q&A, so nobody has any questions. We've just
Can you say that software again?
Oh, it's Voice Dream.
Voice Dream.
I'll send it to you, and you need to send me that info on that book you mentioned.
Okay.
And also, I just want to say there was another book, Les Egerton, Hooked. Is that it? Is that the name? Les Egerton. Is the name Les? I love that book. It taught me all about inciting incidents and stuff. I love that. So, yeah, this has been great, guys. Thank you so much. I'm assuming that there are no questions other than John, who kindly asked a question. We're just so clear. There's nothing anybody could possibly want to know. If anybody's still listening. Hi. Okay, she's cutting off. Okay, so now we have Kayla Ancrum's Designing Escalating Tension. Bye all.
Bye.